Hi, folks. Welcome. We're so glad that everyone is here. Thrilled to see everyone. My name is Nicole Trevina Flores. I am the Global Ed Coordinator here at SEC, otherwise known as the one sending annoying emails all the time, right? I just wanted to thank everyone for being here and for coming to all of the events this week. I hope you grab some international candy there at the back table, and I hope that you will consider, faculty, not students yet, donating to our Global Ed Scholarship. We are almost at endowed status, which is really neat. That scholarship is exclusively for students who are traveling. So if you've ever traveled, you know how amazing that is. So we really hope that you'll think about contributing to that. There's some cards back there. And just any other questions, please let me know. But with that, I want to thank everyone, including our panelists and Kara Benedict and her team, for being here and for setting this up. But I'm going to turn it over to her. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this panel on Bridging Heritage to Current Advocacy for Native and Indigenous People, where we will learn about Indigenous experiences, the lack of resources, and how we can advocate together for and with the Native Indigenous communities. SEC is committed to ensure open access for all through inclusivity, respect, and compassion toward the diverse views of students, faculty, staff, and our community. With this in mind, this event occurs on the traditional lands of the Pawnee Nation. Nebraska is also home to the Ho-Chunk, Omaha, Oto, Ponca, Sac and Fox, and Santee Sioux people. We pay respects to the elders of these nations past, present, and emerging. The panelists will provide some insight on the Native Indigenous communities, and after we will have time for questions. Lindy will introduce the panelists.
Our first panelist will be Joe Starita. He was an investigative reporter in New York and Miami for 15 years before joining the UNL College of Journalism, where he taught depth reporting for 20 years. A two-time Pulitzer Prize nominee, the Lincoln native is the author of 3 acclaimed books on Native Americans: The Dull Knives of Pine Ridge, A Lakota Odyssey, I Am a Man, Chief Standing Bear's Journey for Justice, and A Warrior of the People, How Susan LaFlesche Overcame Racial and Gender Inequality to Become America's First Indian Doctor. Our second panelist will be Cynthia Surrounded by Enemies, Pagan Tribe of the Blackfeet Confederacy. She received both her Bachelor of Science degree and Master's in Forensic Science with emphasis in forensic psychology from Nebraska Wesleyan University. Cynthia's professional history includes teaching at Southeast Community College in the Human Services program and over a decade in law enforcement and a position serving as an expert witness for tribal Indian child welfare concerns and cultural recognition. Other experiences include pathology, sociology, and receiving provisional license alcohol and drug counselor. Always advocating and serving different populations, such as Indian Hospital Services for the Native Social Services Program at Susan in Rapid City, South Dakota, assisting with autopsies and studying the physical evidence to support causes of death. Always implementing course studies of personality characteristics and the role of profiling, violence, mental illness, and risk assessment to better serve diverse populations. She continues to stay proactive in volunteer work. One of the most rewarding is being part of the LOSS, Lancaster of Suicide Survivors team, since 2009. She lives and understands the stressors of urban and homeland life. These conditions have prepared Cynthia to be a strong advocate for Indigenous justice as being part of the mainstream environment. Today, Cynthia will be part in facilitating and providing added information of basic cultural awareness skills about terms, trust, and truth to educate service and professional systems about Indigenous populations. Our third panelist is Kelly R. Warrior, a member of the Southern Ponca tribe of Indians of Oklahoma. Kelly is from White Eagle, Oklahoma, and she grew up in Winnebago, Nebraska. After graduating from Winnebago Public School in 2013, Kelly went to Haskell Indian Nations University, where she played 4 years of college basketball and obtained her bachelor's in Indigenous American Indian Studies. Kelly also enlisted in the U.S. Army National Guard in 2013, where she served for 7 years and received an honorable discharge in October 2020. Kelly is currently working towards her master's degree at Doane University in counseling, and she works for Morningstar Counseling as a case manager. She's the proud assistant coach for the varsity girls basketball team at Walt Hill High School and is an adjunct professor at Nebraska Indian Community College. And our final panelist is Dr. Anitra Warrior. She's an American Indian psychologist from the Ponca tribe of Oklahoma and has dedicated her career to underserved populations throughout the state of Nebraska. She has established clinics and partnerships in areas in which she can reach children, adolescents, and adults in these underserved communities. This includes the use of telehealth services, as well as other accommodations for her clinics or for her clients that are not able to be seen at one of the clinic locations. She maintains a strong and notable presence within the 3 reservations located in Nebraska, which include the Asante, Umanhun, and Winnebago tribes. She has a strong relationship with universities and colleges throughout the state and has served as a professor, a member of the board of directors of the Lincoln Indian Center, Inc., and has been a part of multiple professional associations. She also has an APA-accredited training program through the University of Nebraska Medical Center. Through her work, she is able to provide community-based, college counseling, school-based, and integrated care for underserved communities. Morningstar Counseling started as a one-person private practice that has grown to employ 15 people with 5 clinic locations available to serve communities, as well as multiple independent contractors to expand services throughout the state. Dr. Warrior has also been successful in her progression to launch her nonprofit, Healing Roots Counseling and Training Center, Inc. In addition to these many attributes, she has earned recognition on the city, state, and national level. Dr. Warrior has also been a mentor, presenter, and now organizer for Frontier Area Rural Mental Health Camp and Mentorship Program, known as Farm Camp. She has extended the program to Northeast Nebraska under a new brand, Grow Our Own, which includes mentorship across the country for American Indian scholars, as well as developed a program in partnership with the tribal colleges in Nebraska to recruit high school and college students to the field of psychology. Dr. Warrior has also participated in several professional presentations regarding behavioral health, stigma, and mental illness. As an Indigenous woman, she is committed to developing the workforce within the Native American community, and as a psychologist, she is able to recognize the impact of historical and intergenerational trauma, and how her clinic must utilize culturally appropriate and trauma-informed support and services for the students and professionals within the communities that she serves. Please join me in welcoming our panelists today.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Is the mic working? Yes? Okay, all right. I think panelists in general sometimes are not as grateful as they should be for these kinds of opportunities, and I don't think any of us want to be those panelists. We're not. So I want to make it very clear from the get-go that we are very honored to be here, to be invited to speak to you, and we are very appreciative for you to turn out, and we hope that we get some good questions from you. I'm an investigative reporter by training, so I, by training, drill down and am guided by facts. And I may say some things in the next 14 minutes that you find offensive or too harsh, but that's the beauty of the country that we live in. And we have that opportunity. And we need to respect that opportunity, and we need to take advantage of it. That said, I believe, and I have believed for many, many, many years, that you cannot really understand the history of America without understanding the history of Native America. That the two histories are intertwined like a double DNA helix. And that relationship, those historical narratives, have often been rife with misinformation, disinformation, anger, hatred, stereotypes, ignorance. And the only way you can confront that is to deal with it head on and keep digging down and keep looking for the truth. And that began from the get-go, the relationship between America and Native America. When a woebegone Italian sailor who thought he was sailing east when he was really sailing west, who thought he had ended up in India when he actually ended up in North America, that set the ball rolling into a complex relationship that often was misguided. And yet we credit Christopher Columbus with discovering America. Did he discover America? In 1492, there were hundreds and hundreds of indigenous communities and thousands of Native people who had lived where we are sitting now, who had lived on this continent for thousands and thousands of years. This fundamental problem of not getting the facts right has caused all kinds of problems and led to terrific misunderstandings between American culture and Native American culture that are true right up till this day. Rick Santorum, I'm assuming that's a name that most of you know. Let's fast forward from 1492 until the spring of 2021, when I saw Rick Santorum give a talk to a group of young Republicans at a convention in April. And what I heard him say is exactly the point I'm trying to make, that this institutional ignorance and disrespect, really, for an entire culture has caused a lot of problems that are shaped by the sheer ignorance and an aversion to the truth. And so when I read what he had said and told this group of young adults like you, I was very angry. And I did what I often do when I'm angry. I sat down and I wrote. In this case, I wrote a letter to the Lincoln Journal-Star. And I think the easiest thing for me to do to encapsulate how I felt when I had heard what Rick Santorum had told this group of young 18, 19, 20-year-olds, the easiest thing for me is just to read the letter that I wrote to the Lincoln Journal-Star, which I will do now. And I have to tell you that I'm a bit of a smartass, particularly when I'm really unhinged by somebody else's ignorance. Quote, "We birthed a nation from nothing. I mean, there was nothing here. I mean, yes, we have Native Americans, but candidly, there isn't much Native American culture in American culture." Unquote. So said Rick Santorum, ex-U.S. Senator, presidential wannabe, and former CNN analyst at an April 23rd Young America's Foundation event. Okay, history genius, let's see if we can trump your alternative facts with some real ones. Candidly, your cancel culture coup attempt must have come as somewhat of a surprise to the Iroquois. After all, it was some guy named Franklin, then I believe, who credited the Iroquois with heavily influencing the framers of the U.S. Constitution, who said he and the Founding Fathers relied on the native system of government to shape the American one. A 1988 U.S. Senate resolution spelled it out. Quote, "The confederation of the original 13 colonies into one republic was influenced by the political system developed by the Iroquois Confederacy, as were many of the democratic principles which were incorporated into the Constitution itself." Or, as Onondaga Chief Orrin Lyons put it, quote, "If Americans are going to celebrate the anniversary of the Constitution, we figure we had better let them know where it came from." So, outside of providing America with its Constitution, showing its people how to cultivate cotton, rubber, chocolate, corn, potatoes, tomatoes, wild rice, and tobacco, how to raise turkeys and honeybees, ignoring Lewis and Clark's guides, subtracting the addition of canoes, snowshoes, and baby bottles, and dismissing the fact that 22 U.S. states derive from native words, yes, you are absolutely correct. There really was nothing here. Not unlike the space between your ears. All right, so I'm telling you, I get riled up when I see comments like Native Americans contributed nothing. And those need to be confronted. Those need to be pushed back against. Fast forward to today, when there is another issue that is in front of us. The man who is likely to be the next governor of Nebraska, gentleman by the name of Jim Pillen. If he has his way, if he had his way, you would be taught a whole different dimension of American history. Because Jim Pillen, Board of Regents at the University of Nebraska, a couple of months ago, authored a resolution that would require the banning of what is called critical race theory from being taught in any public school classroom in Nebraska. Critical race theory, a phrase that I'm sure you have heard and probably heard often, and maybe you've talked about it in your classes at Southeast Community College, I don't know, but it's been in the air for a long time, and Regent Pillen is very adamant that critical race theory not be leaked into the teaching of American history. I have a real problem with that. Because it distorts the truth. It distorts the truth. And in a democracy that we have sustained for more than 250 years, truth is as vital to our democracy as oxygen is to ourselves. We cannot function as a democracy without the truth. And so we need to protect that and embrace that. Late on the morning of December 29th, 1890, along the banks of Wounded Knee Creek on South Dakota's Pine Ridge Reservation, the remnants of Custer's 7th Cavalry opened fire on a village of Lakota Sioux. An hour or so later, when the last Gatling guns had been fired, when the last cannons had been fired, when the last rifles had been shot, there was an eerie silence that swept across the Lakota village along Wounded Knee Creek. The official U.S. Army count listed 290 dead Lakota, many of whom were women and children, many of whom had been shot in the back as they tried to flee the cannons, the newly released Gatling gun, and the rifles. Brigadier General Nelson Miles, who oversaw the battle, wrote a very personal, very sensitive, very horrifying letter to a close friend several weeks later, describing what had happened late on the morning of December 29th, 1890, along Wounded Knee Creek. In one part of the letter to his close personal friend, he described one of the 290 victims that they found. It was a baby. They had found nursing at her mother's breast. The little girl had been shot in the back 5 times. A few weeks later, the United States Congress awarded 20 members of the 7th Cavalry medals of honor for courage and valor on the battlefield, for shooting women and children in the back. That's not critical race theory. That's American history. And we do no one any favors by trying to cover up that aspect of history. As a democracy, for 250 years, the guiding light of democratic societies, we need to build our history on a foundation of facts, on a foundation of truth. We don't want to invite the adage of those who forget history are condemned to repeat it. We don't want to go there. And it all begins with all of you. It all begins with your generation, this generation of students, that you push back against those who want to build the historical narrative on a foundation of lies. A famous American once said, "Give the people the truth, and the nation will be free." And it's quite possible old Abe was onto something. He just might have been onto something. I thank all of you very much, again, for joining us today and for, I hope, remembering the one takeaway question I want to leave you with. What happens? What happens to a democracy if truth no longer matters? Thank you so much.
Can you hear me? Yes? All right. So I'm the panelist that's going to be the visual person, okay? So I have a slideshow. I'd like to start. My name is Cynthia. Again, thank you for all of you for showing up today. It means a lot to all of us. I am going to show a cartoon that was first shared in 1947. It's a cartoon that I remember watching. I'm not that old yet. I remember watching it for the next 2 decades and how it would increase stereotypes of Native and Indigenous people. I will play about 25 seconds of it. This slide, I want you to remember it because I will tie it to the end of my presentation. Play. Uh-oh, where'd it go? It might take a minute.
No others near. Colonel, he vows these two soon disappear. Fighting the army blue, soldiers galore. What can 2 Indians do? Go, 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 first watch 'em go, go, go. Go, 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 first watch 'em go, go, go. Here comes the colonel with his sergeant, both are roaring and a charging.
Okay, I think you got the idea, right?
Go, 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 first.
I want to get out of here. Remember that visual. I will tie it to the last slide. The next slide, I would talk about the top 8 nations in the United States of America. The first one is the Cherokee, second Navajo, the Choctaw, the Chippewa, the Sioux, the Apache, the Blackfeet, and the Cree. Each of our nations have our own flags, such as Nebraska has its own flag. Each nation has numbers of tribes underneath. For instance, the Choctaw have over 12 tribes. The Sioux Nation have over 7 tribes. The Chippewa, believe it or not, including Canada, has over 150 tribes. Alaska has the most indigenous population for land base. And again, there's our visual of each flag. The next slide, I'd like to ask if anyone might like to tell me to drive my point home. What is the motto of Nebraska? Does anybody know it? Can somebody say it? The good life? How about if I told you that was wrong? It's not for everyone? I like that. What is listed on our flag in Nebraska is equality before the law. And I want you to remember that as Nebraska, and as we build relationships with diverse cultures, that we practice the equality above the law. It's not the good life. Also, in Nebraska, we have home bases and reservations of certain tribes, the Omaha, the Winnebago. The Ponca actually have a location in Iowa and in South Dakota, the Santee Sioux and the Saxon Fox. The largest state in America that have the most tribes is California, with over 109 tribes. I like to bring up the fact that historically we have always referenced North America as Turtle Island. And each nation in this country has its own language for that name, and we call it the Kia Island, which means turtle. As you can see, the middle one, our ancestors knew before the planes were invented that we, as living on North America, it was shaped like a turtle. And because we have not been kind to North America and taken good care of her, she now looks like the right side or your left side, depends on what you're looking at. And to me, it looks more like a kangaroo, not a turtle. I also want to give respect to our indigenous nations of North America, that our creation story starts with a woman, and to hold that in your heart, that it is different than maybe what your belief system is. And that itself is a presentation, so I will go on to the next slide. As of 2020, in North America, included Canada, all the blue was inhabited by our indigenous people. As of 2020, there's over 574 tribes that is recognized by the BIA. The BIA was founded in 1824 by our government, and before it was the BIA, you know what it was called? I have it up there. What was it called? It was the War Department. So that's a strong root not to understand or to trust the government. It was actually the War Department. I also would like to talk about a term, reservations, that you all are familiar with, and where maybe the first terms were used when our land bases were created and we were forced upon. The first term was called reserves. The Canadians still use this term. It was to represent Her Majesty, the Queen of England, and today in Canada there's over 3,000 reserves. The second term that we used in the United States of America was forts, like Fort Omaha, Fort Dodge, Fort Robinson. Do you all know where that term came from? Ask some of our students, where did that come from? What does it remind you when you hear a fort? What? Fort Derek, because it was said? I didn't hear that. Fortress, oh. Yes, it's actually, you heard of Fort Benning? It's a military base, you all. The next term in 1820 to 1851, the term was agency. And then finally, Congress passed, according to the Appropriation Act of 1851, coined the term reservations. As us living on our homeland, we prefer homeland or even land-based or homeland. We live in BIA houses. They're numbered such as 55, 77, and today there's over 326 federal land bases in the United States. I'd like to talk about some modern truths. Currently, there's up to 5 million indigenous people living in the world. They cover over 90 countries. We account for 15% of extreme poverty. There's poverty, and then there's extreme poverty. We also live approximately 20 years less than our mainstream brothers and sisters. And we also are usually the last to receive public investment or basic services, such as clean running water, such as heat, such as food that's not fouled or mildewed that's given to us. And what's so ironic about all this, yes, I'm a proud mother, we are the largest population to voluntarily list into our military. Where can you advocate? Just the beginning, you all. By showing up today, you're taking the first step. we'd like to ask you that we have multiple barriers to participate fully in our formal economy. We would like to be included in those decision makings. We'd also like to be looked at as placements in leadership roles. We also would like to be judged by our peers in the local social justice system, as the Constitution states, right? It says that you must be judged by your peers. I'm still waiting for that to happen. Also, usually, we are not considered to participate in any makings or any policy structure on the city level, on a county level, or a state level. So please ask yourself, what are the causes of these exclusions? Again, go back to terms. People always say, what do you like to be called? Do you like to be called Indian, Native, American Indian? You know what? All you need to do is ask. I don't mind Indian because that's what our government uses in our state laws or federal laws. The term Indian is still there. Canadians and some Native Americans in the US use red people or red nation. Also, Native Americans is actually a assimilated term that has been around for a long time. And then there's First Nation people. The next slide, I'm going to show you what media seems to call us in 2021. We are referred as the something else population. Really? Continue. Do you say American Indians? I'm going to ask you all, critically think about this. When we start saying American Dutch, American German, American Danish, then maybe American Indians. We believe that we do not own Mother Earth. This divide of terms continues the conflict. Also, to ask somebody if they are enrolled into a tribe is a lot of red tape, you all. That's a presentation in itself. To be respectful, ask what tribe affiliation are you? Also, back to the traditional word of indigenous, it actually means we sprung from the land. We have ties culturally to our identity, to our spirituality, and to our physical being, to the land. Please do not use Indigenous Americans. Some more terms. There's many, but I will tell you at least half of these terms I still hear weekly from professionals, from friends. First one, TP. You all know the correct way to spell TP. It's T-I-P-I. The word chief is a respectful name. I don't know how many times my Indigenous family male members have been called chief. Please knock it off. Also, wild Indian. I guess when we can start saying wild white people, maybe we can say wild Indian. Bottom of the totem pole. You all, that's where you want to be. From the indigenous culture, the bottom of the totem pole is the one with the most wisdom, the one that has the strength to hold everyone up. The term redskins, we don't say white skins. Circle of the wagons, a very traumatic term that is used in history. The next one, tribe. I think this is a new buzzword. I've heard in the last couple of years people use it to gather. They use it to get with their besties. Again, when you are survival of almost complete genocide, then maybe you can use the word tribe. Geronimo is also used in self-glorifying. He was a grand man, a human being that died for his people. The term squaw actually refers to a private part of an indigenous woman, and it's not nice. On the warpath, hold down the fort. I think you're getting my idea, right? Pocahontas. Really? When you want to call a beautiful indigenous woman Pocahontas, please do not do that. It's actually one of the first documentations of child trafficking, you all. Our oral tradition tells us she was probably 12 years old, maybe 14 at the oldest, and she was with a grown man. Drunker than 10 Indians. That's actually the first introduction of chemical warfare. The last, powwows. Really? Powwows are very sacred. They're not office meetings. Now I'd like to end. This is Bren. This is of October 21st, 2021, in the last month. This is an educated math teacher, an Indigenous student. Some of you have maybe seen this, and this is what she does. Let me see if I can. So, from 75 years from the first cartoon clip I just showed you, how far have we really gone? I ask you all. Here are some resources. I want to brag about our panel for a minute. We have the Morning Star up there, these two ladies right here. Thank you for having me today.
Hello. Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Kelly Warrior. I really want to appreciate you all for allowing me to be here and for your undivided attention. And thank you, panelists, for expressing yourself. So today, I will just be talking about my experience as an Indigenous person and just walking in two worlds. So I grew up in White Eagle, Oklahoma, which is home to the Ponca Nation. And then I also grew up in Winnebago, Nebraska. I spent majority of my life bouncing back and forth between the two, and I have little pockets of growing up in Lincoln. And growing up in Lincoln was definitely extremely challenging for me. And so once I had finished 8th grade, this was a really significant time for me because you're a teenager, you're figuring yourself out, you're learning about your identity and who you are. And I grew up primarily on a reservation with people who shared the same language, jokes, cultural practices, who looked like me. And whenever I enrolled here at Lincoln Southeast, that was extremely challenging for me. We started school in August, and unfortunately, I had only been there for 3 months. And within that 3 months, my mental health had went down significantly. To me, like, what was most important in my life was basketball. And going to Southeast, I felt like I wasn't seen as a person. My grades were slipping. Like, I didn't make a good team on basketball. I had a couple friends, and then all of a sudden I didn't have any, and I was eating alone at lunch. And that might not sound harsh right now, but as a 13-year-old, 14-year-old, that is extremely lonely and difficult. And one thing that really sucks about like that situation is at Southeast, nobody's seen me, nobody heard me, and I couldn't connect to anybody because nobody looked like me and nobody cared. And that was, excuse me for getting emotional, but that was really hard. And it's hard for our Indigenous students to be seen in places off the reservation. And it's not only me who feels like that, it's our women. Raise your hand if you're familiar with missing and murdered Indigenous women. I encourage you to look around the room. And right now, here in the United States, there is a significant phenomenon of missing and murdered Indigenous women disappearing. And Omaha is within the top 5 cities of missing women. So it's just not me as a student. I'm one person of the rest of my relatives, extended relatives who feel this way. I beg people to, whenever I was 14, I begged people to see me. But that video that Cynthia showed, that's the representation I get. That is how people view me, and it's disgusting. So that's just kind of like modern times of what it is to walk in both worlds. But after my mom, she was so kind, and she's seen that I was hurting, and so she allowed me to move to Winnebago. And there, I thrived as a student. I was in one act, I was in debate, I was on a National Honor Society, I was around people who looked like me, I even got into college courses. I went from a failing student with significant mental health issues to a star student and a star athlete. And from that environment, I went on to Haskell Indian Nations University, where I served in the U.S. Army National Guard, which I'm really proud about, as Cynthia shared. It's such a privilege to carry on the legacy of Native Americans having the highest serving per capita. So that's something that I hold dear to my heart. But while I was doing that, I went on to Haskell Indian Nations University. I'm the women's and men's scoring record holder, and I had a child while I was there, and I kept going to school, and now I'm getting my master's, planning on going for my doctorate. And I have Thank you so much. But you know, it just sucks because I should have had that same support. My needs should have been met at Southeast, but it wasn't. And I'm being real and honest, and it hurts to say this, but sometimes the reservation isn't nice because of all of the normalized dysfunction and the historical trauma. But that's home. That's where people care about me. That's where I'm seen. So I'd rather go through that than live in the city. And that's just the harsh reality of being a minority to a country you're indigenous to. So I want to thank you for your time, and I appreciate you for allowing me to be here.
Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for your attendance today and your attention. And thank you to the panelists for what you had shared. I appreciate the personal stories. I'm always open to hearing a smart ass. So I liked what you shared as well, Joe. That was very nice to hear. And I think it's good to share the history and the facts that are part of our history. So today what I'm going to talk about is some of the mental health disparities. And what I really want to focus on is coming from an area of thriving, because I think when you hear about American Indians or Native Americans or indigenous populations, what's always put out there is the struggle, the struggle. And it's almost like we get into this place where we thrive on the struggle and not so much thrive on the win. And so that's something that I want to shift for our people and for the general population to understand about us as well. So when Kelly's talking about being on the reservation and having that time there and being seen, that's so important, and it may not be understood at multiple levels, but something I want to highlight with that is when you think about historically what has been stolen from the population, forcibly stolen, and pathologically stolen, I would say, because there are still things that are continuing today with theft, but that means that we're in a place to where we want to hold on to the culture that we do have remaining. We're starving for that. We are trying to find that. We are trying to reconnect, and I honestly wish we were able to have Mr. Pilcher up here because he shared so much amazing information in his presentation earlier before everyone had arrived. It was just very powerful in terms of the representation of some of our practices, our beliefs, and just what we've transitioned through in our society and how we maintain our health. So I think it's important to recognize that and know that when we're talking about being around people that look like us, being around people that can see us, that can meet our needs, that comes from somewhere. So it's again going back to that level of historical trauma where we've had so much taken from us that we're trying to hold on to that. Our identity is tied into that, and it's so valuable. So building on that, I want to share a little bit about my own personal story and how I became a psychologist. So we're originally from Oklahoma, and we have, much like Nebraska, significant tornadoes that will come through. And so in May of 1999, my oldest daughter, she was 4 at the time, we were all home, and there was a huge tornado that came through, and it wiped out the majority of our neighborhood. It was horrendous, and we lost 42 people. And my daughter had sustained significant injuries, and she was one of those that had lost her life. And so, as you could imagine, as a young mother, my grief was significant. I wasn't making very good decisions and really struggled to find my way. And I started meeting with therapists, and I met with just your, run-of-the-mill therapist. I also met with Christian therapists, and really struggled to connect with them. And part of that was because my culture was not included in that treatment. Whenever I would bring up things about my beliefs with how we grieve, our practices, it really seemed to be pathologized. And when I say pathologized, I mean it's turned into something negative that is having a harmful impact on my well-being. So that's what the pathology would be about. And so there would be different things that I would share, and it would go back to medication. Well, let's check your medication. Let's talk with your psychiatrist. And I recognized that I had PTSD. I was grieving, and that was, a natural disaster can cause PTSD for anyone. And so I continued to work with them and was going. I think I saw about 4 therapists, maybe 5. And this place of healing was anything but a place of healing. It was not safe because my true being, my true self, was being pathologized. I couldn't bring who I was into that room to help me heal, and it ended up hurting me even longer. And my healing time was really challenged as a result. And what I found more comfort in wasn't necessarily the actual therapy itself, but telling my story, using a trauma narrative, and talking with people from my tribe, participating in our cultural events, and making that a part of my life again. And that was really where the healing started to occur. And so that's something that is ingrained within us. This is like part of our DNA. This is something that we need. It's like medicine for our soul. And that was huge for me. And so as someone who is pretty loud, can be an advocate for many things, I thought to myself, with someone that is as loud as I am and willing to speak up about any type of deficiencies, and I'm experiencing this in the counseling setting with multiple therapists, what are other people of color experiencing, other marginalized populations? So not just for Native people, not just Indigenous people, but anyone who's been marginalized. How are they able to truly heal in the counseling session? So I ended up deciding I'm going to go to college, I'm going to be a psychologist. Didn't fully know what that meant when I said psychologist, but I knew that that's what I was going to do. My goal was to serve marginalized populations, focus on trauma, and then to be able to train people to work with, again, the marginalized populations. So that's what we're doing now. We're able to do that. We incorporate culture. And when we're talking about, as I had mentioned, the theft of our culture, or what Joe had recognized in terms of not even acknowledging the presence of our culture, what I'm able to share in our training with our evidence-based theoretical models is those are things, those are skills, those are interventions that have already been in place for many Native cultures. When we're doing our beadwork, the songs that Mr. Pilcher was singing earlier, that's a level of mindfulness, but it's not described through a Western model. It's not described as an evidence-based practice, but this is something that's been healing for generations and generations and generations. And so when we can adapt that perspective to understanding that healing does not just come from this Western model of treatment, and we're able to recognize that and bring that into our sessions, that makes a huge difference for people that we're serving. So I think that's really important for us to recognize. For me as a psychologist, I do a lot of the cognitive behavioral therapy, so CBT. Some of you may have heard of it, some not, but it's really thinking about the relationship and the influence of our mind, our emotional experience, and our actions, and what we need to change. And in meeting with elders from different tribal communities, this is something that many of them have been told by their grandparents. And so anytime they share that with me, I let them know that, well, this is how I do my work, and explain some of that to them. And so it's really helpful for me to be able to hear that, because that helps strengthen our role within the counseling session. So I'm very proud of the opportunities that we have. We do a lot of partnerships in terms of being able to provide services, not only in Lincoln, but we actually have 7 locations now. We're in a couple of colleges. We do a lot of partnership with the University of Nebraska Medical Center, and again, provide services statewide. What I would also like to highlight, though, in saying that we provide services statewide, is that we also do this for rural populations as well. And I incorporate those cultural components into the work that we do with our rural populations. So I remember sitting in a session in Rushville. So I don't know if anybody knows where Rushville, Nebraska is, but very, very western part of the state. And I'm sitting in there, and one of in the session, and the woman is working there, and she's talking about how she's tired of these lazy drunk Indians that she's always seeing, and I'm just like, okay, that really doesn't describe me, but and the majority of our population it doesn't describe. But that was just an experience that I had with her. And so when I continued to serve in rural populations, I found that the practices that we use that are specific to our culture have been very effective in these same communities. And I'll admit I was a little bit nervous about serving some of these rural populations, that really concerned about, how they would connect with me. And it's actually been very successful in the work that we've done. But it came down to using some of those similar experiences. And the reason that I'm highlighting that is because there are more similarities than there are differences. And recognizing people, as being connected, as us all being citizens of this state, of this country, of this land, living with the land, is really important for us in terms of what our healing looks like for our country, for our earth, for us as people, and how we move through our country. So what I ask of people is to really just be informed and challenge different stereotypes that you hear, and allow for that acceptance of the differences in beliefs, because those differences really aren't that different at all. There are, again, a lot of similarities that can help us, and we have opportunities to learn from one another to just enhance our own well-being. So and that's my message for today. So again, I encourage you to challenge those stereotypes, learn more about our communities, and embrace those differences and how they can help in your own well-being. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for sharing your stories and for educating us. I really, really appreciate it. And now we're going to move on to the Q&A. We're going to start with the people here in the audience. So if you have a question, we're going to have 2 people on each side. And then for people who are watching live streaming, they have 2 options. But if you don't want to ask a question here in public, you have 2 options. You can go to that website or text N1921 to 22333. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and one of us is going to come to you to give you the microphone. No questions? All right.
Okay, so I have a question about advocacy. So what's a good way to advocate for the community?
First of all, like Joe said, teach the proper critical race theory. It's our history, it's the law policies. That's what critical race theory is. It's not opinions or biases. Also, to support events such as this, coming and asking questions, get involved. You know, when you see an Indigenous person, invite them to the local meeting or the council. That's where it starts.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, there's a lot of ways to advocate. So I love what she said in terms of attending these events. I think it's also important to share information. So not just be present and receive it, but to also share it is going to be huge. And in situations to where maybe we're in a class or something, share information that you've learned that will challenge stereotypes. I remember going to a class to give a presentation, and one of the things that was shared during that class was asking about the gene that we have that makes us alcoholics. And so that, as you could imagine, I was pretty upset about that. Held my cool though, but being able to challenge that, you know, and challenge these stereotypes that are put out there is going to be huge. So as Cynthia had shared, you know, we have a number of tribes. There's over 570 tribes right now. But even with that many tribes, we're still like 1% of the population. There's only about 4 to 5 million people who identify as American Indian. So we have such a small population that we're not often at the table. She also highlighted how on CNN, they referenced us as something else. And so that could be a mix, or people who are biracial. It could be a number of things, but we're not even included. And we're the first inhabitants of this continent and not included. So being able to really be a voice for a population that is marginalized, that is so small, is really important, because it's interesting to me that even with such a small population, how attacked we are, and not fully understanding what that's about. Again, 5 million out of the whole country, but there's like all of these things that come out about us. So I think being able to be that voice, because there are so many times where we are left out in these situations, and then it allows these misconceptions to grow when someone isn't there to challenge those stereotypes. So that would be my biggest vote in terms of what advocacy could look like. Thank you for that question.
All right, any other questions? Right there, okay.
So I was wondering if there was any ways that we can get involved, like for me personally, like as a non-native, to get like involved in the community and stuff like that.
Thank you for that. So she was asking if there were ways to get involved. Absolutely. So with the Lincoln Indian Center, that's kind of our hub. That's like I don't know if that's the right language, but that's where we have a lot of events for the community, but that's for all tribes, all people to be a part of. And so they're in a state of rebuilding right now, but we still have a number of community events. So even being able to follow their page, they do a lot of different things that support not only the Native community, but our entire community of Lincoln. So I think that's really nice. There are a number of events that they have that will even support food, doing fundraisers. There are cultural practices that are open to the public that we would, be more than happy to see people at. We also have different events where we might have the school board come in, or we've had legislators come in and, learn more about our community. So that would be a great place to start, is with the Lincoln Indian Center. Thank you.
I think another thing that's really important is just to try and do it on the human level, on the one-on-one level. If you have a Native American student in your class or somewhere in your social orbit, try and befriend that person. Native Americans often come to college campuses with a whole different set of backgrounds and needs than urban students do. And the numbers are just staggering. The University of Nebraska-Lincoln has 25,000 plus students. Guess how many of that 25,000 are Native American? Anybody want to take a shot at that? Anybody up here want to take a shot at that? Or how many of the 25,000 just at UNL are Native American? 53. UNL has 53 Native students out of 25,000. And a lot of them are from reservation communities. And that is a huge jump to go from the Santee Reservation to a dorm room that has almost as many people as your community. And you often spend your day walking around seeing nobody who looks like you. And that's an enormous issue. It's an enormous issue on reservations, the lack of role models, the lack of, I have students who grew up on the Omaha Reservation and went from K through 12 and never saw a Native teacher in their classroom. You can't be what you can't see. And so the ability just to befriend somebody, that's what college is about, is not hanging out with people who look like you and think like you, but take chances. Take chances. Find out about a whole different culture, a whole different way of life, because that window in taking chances closes pretty quickly. And often if you aren't taking chances when you're your age and in college, each growing year, there's less likely for you to take a chance. So I just think that's a really important part of being a student, is taking chances and getting to know people who do not look like you or think like you or come from backgrounds like you. So it's a great opportunity.
I'm going to share just a little bit more to kind of highlight or give an additional example of that. For me, growing up in my tribal community, we have, whenever we're home and we have public events, it's very rare that you would ever hear me speak. And typically, in public events, it would either be my husband speaking for me or an elder that's speaking for me. And that's not something that's disrespectful to me. That's an honor to share what my thoughts are, my feelings, and allow them to express that on my behalf. And when we're in a situation where we're learning, we're typically quiet during those times. And so for me, going into school and being, especially at the graduate level, where it's really competitive, you're expected to speak out and do a lot of presentations, that was very uncomfortable for me, and I really struggled with that. And I would get, dinged by my professors for not being a bit more assertive in that approach, but it was very, very uncomfortable. And it's interesting though, because that's like one side of me when I'm there as a student and being respectful and sometimes I would have questions and I didn't get them in because I didn't want to interrupt. I didn't want to interrupt another student. I didn't want to interrupt the professor. So there's like this real humble piece of us. But then there's this other side of me. I used to do promotions for a radio station. And so I was thinking about that even before we started. Like, ooh, do I want to hype everybody up before we get started? Do I want to try to play that role? But going back to colleges, you know, it's really important to think about what our roles are when we're there as students and why you might see some of that difference. And a lot of it's culture, and a lot of it's about being respectful to the setting in which we're in at the time.
All right. Any other questions from the audience here?
Sorry. As another modern day example, can you guys share a little bit about the great impacts that COVID pandemic has had on the Native community?
I'll take this one too. So yeah, we actually at this point, through partnerships with the Indian Health Service, we've had a number of people that are getting vaccinated. We're still seeing a lot of breakthrough cases, but at the start of the pandemic, the tribes really, I thought, had very nice leadership roles that I think the country probably could have learned from in terms of what their care looked like, how they supported the quarantine process. But because we have such disparities in healthcare treatment, once we had that happening, that spread, it was huge. And so we've lost a lot of people. We've lost a lot of elders that held knowledge, that spoke our language fluently. So it's the COVID pandemic has been tremendous in terms of the harm that it's caused to tribal nations. Again, because of the way the language was lost, so much history lost. But then there are other components in terms of when we start thinking about our overall well-being. So with these huge number of losses that we've experienced, we typically have a process of grieving, of what our ceremonies look like, and throughout that time, it wasn't safe for us to do those. We had to be protective of each other. So as I had shared my story earlier in terms of not being able to use my culture to heal, we're still seeing that today. So we've had a lot of people that have struggled with isolation that's led to depression and anxiety, similar to what you'd see across the general population, but it's so condensed because it's in such a small community with little resources available. So, you know, issues with substance abuse, kind of creeping back up for some people, and that's related to the depression. So the substance abuse is a symptom of that. In addition, it's been very traumatizing in a sense of, one, of course, the loss that I mentioned, but this has caused people to really revisit other forms of trauma that they've experienced throughout their life. In addition to the pandemic itself, we've had a number of findings come up through our boarding schools where, and I don't know how many of you might be familiar with this, but through the boarding schools that were in place for our indigenous populations, we're finding bodies of children at these schools now. And it's not, very rarely would you see this shared on mainstream media. At this point, there have been over 7,000 bodies of children, of babies, that have been recovered from these schools. We have a number of survivors now that are grieving that are feeling re-traumatized. I've had a number of senior citizens reach out to me and to share what this has been like for them, and how it's causing all of these things to come up, but then when you're isolated or you have other underlying conditions, trying to go out and get support is really a challenge. So I think overall, we've seen a lot of challenges in terms of what this has done for mental health, for physical health, and again, same for the general population, but going back to the small community, those cultural implications, it's been unique to our indigenous populations and what that struggle has been like.
I want to just add something to that I found absolutely fascinating. about a month ago, the Omaha World Herald did a very detailed fact-based statistical analysis of COVID rates in throughout Nebraska. And as you know, many of you know, Nebraska is a state comprised of 93 counties. And Paul Hamill at the World Herald spent weeks digging into the medical records, and then they reflected this in a map of all 93 counties. And what they discovered after this long database research effort that coughed up this article, complete with the map of all 93 counties, the county in Nebraska that had the highest vaccination rate at 78% was Thurston County, which is also home to the Omaha and Winnebago reservations, which is also the poorest, not second, not eighth, not 20th. Thurston County, Nebraska, is the poorest of Nebraska's 93 counties, and yet it had the highest vaccination rate. And if you went 70 miles west of Thurston County to Cass County, the vaccination rate in 70 miles dropped from 78% in the poorest county to 23% in Cass County. What accounts for that? And Anitra may have lots of thoughts on that, but one of the thoughts that I had is, how does the poorest county in Nebraska end up with the highest vaccination rate? One part of that answer is that Native culture, then and now, has always been what I would call a we-based culture. It's been a culture that's based around the first person plural pronoun, whereas the dominant culture is a culture that's primarily based around the first person singular pronoun. It's a we-based culture in some ways versus a me-based culture. And that has sustained Native culture, has been one element in sustaining them through all of the historical trauma that has happened in the last 400 or 500 years. There's a thought that I have to get vaccinated because I live with my grandma and grandpa, and they have problems, health problems, and I can't walk into the home after I get out of school at 3:15 and risk infecting them. So they're offering a vaccination at school, I'm going to get it. That's a rather remarkable statistic, I think, that you can go from 78% in the poorest county to 23% just moving 70 miles west. But one of the things that I'm not only interested in, but more accurately obsessed with, is the interplay between language and culture. How language influences culture and culture influences language. And native languages reinforce the idea of this we-based culture. Oklahoma is a Choctaw word that means red people. We know them as the Navajo, but in their own communities, they are known as the Diné, and the Diné literally translates into the people. Lakota is a word that means alliance of friends. So the language reinforces the culture, and the culture in turn creates the language that reflects that culture. And I've always found that and you can look at that 1,000 different ways of how language impacts culture and how culture impacts the language. But it's really interesting when you get into the native world and you see how much of the language reflects this we concept. I mean, you couldn't survive in Nebraska 200, 300, 400 years ago as an individual. The winters were too harsh. The food was too scarce. Crazy Horse was beloved by his people, the Oglala, because he would go out and come back with 2 elk and 3 deer, and he would give away everything he had to the elders of the tribe or to the families that didn't have a son who could go out and hunt. And that whole concept is how these tribes were able to survive as a we culture. And it's interesting to see something that's a month old that shows in Thurston County, the poorest in the state, 78% of that county is vaccinated. Enough Sociology 101.
All right. Thank you so much. Any other?
Okay. Dr. Warrior, you mentioned that you utilize CBT, open acceptance and acknowledgement. And what I just guess I was curious, what other methods and techniques do you use while counseling in your practice to Indigenous people?
I had a little bit of difficulty hearing everything you said, but I think you were asking about interventions that we use that fit with Native culture?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, we have a lot actually that we use. So when you're governed by insurance, there has to be certain ways or certain languages that you use in order to bill. And so knowing the culture and knowing your interventions is very important because of the language that we need to use to sustain our business. If we could do it for free, we absolutely would, but we have to pay the bills. So there are different things that we do. I'll use trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, okay? So with that, you might remember I talked about sharing my story and using that as a trauma narrative. This is a big, big part of TFCBT and the treatment model for anyone who's experienced, children who have experienced trauma. They go through and they formulate their story of what their experience was, and they share it in the therapeutic session over and over and over. And then they share it with people that are important to them. This is something that tribal people have been doing through our songs, through our time in sweat. And so when we're talking about what treatment might look like, we could even revisit some of those songs or allow them that opportunity to make a song. And we have songs now that could be about specific battles, that could be specifically for our children. I know within our tribe, we have a children's song that is sang at many, many events, but it's that same song that has been sang for hundreds of years. And so it's still that trauma narrative that's being put out there for our people to continue with that healing. So that's one example of how we incorporate culture into the work that we're doing, but able to explain it through the evidence-based model for cognitive behavior therapy. But I could probably do a full session if you want, just let me know. I could go through a number of interventions. I like to talk about that stuff, so I'm gonna try not to get hyped up right now.
Hello? Thank you. To piggyback off what she said too, is the fact that our thinking wave is circular, not linear, and such as treatments, the 12 steps is very linear. And think about how you can do that in a circular fashion. And also the last thing you tell a Native person to be is how to be Native. I think when we share our stories somewhat and to believe what we're telling you, you don't walk our walk, as they say, and that we want our truth to be heard from our voices and not from what you might think it is.
Okay. We need a microphone right here.
Hi. First, thank you so much for being here and sharing. I was really excited when I heard about this from my professors, and just really appreciate the time and energy that it takes to put something like this on. I'm an alcohol and drug addiction treatment student, and the place I'm doing my practicum right now is they have a lot of good things going for them, but it's also very white. And I guess I'm just wondering, I guess mostly Dr. Anitra, if you have any resources that you recommend or suggest that I might be able to recommend to patients in the treatment center, or resources for even the staff and coworkers there to suggest to make it a more inclusive space for some of the clients who are Indigenous and Black?
So yeah, Morning Star Counseling would be one, which is our clinic, and we're on Facebook. Our website is morningstar-counseling.com. Feel free to use that as a resource. The Lincoln Indian Center also has a program called Women Are Sacred, and they really work to incorporate culture as well. There are the Nebraska Urban Indian Health Coalition also has a number of programs that are available that support substance abuse, and even contacting the tribes. So whatever, let's say if you have a person who's enrolled with a specific tribe, if they have contact with them. The one thing that I would highlight though is we do have to be cautious about where people are in terms of their cultural identity. So I'm not super traditional, but I know enough to use that for my strength. It's part of my identity. It's something that keeps me healthy, but I've served people who want nothing to do with their tribal culture. So that's really important to recognize that and respect that. But those agencies that I have listed are always more than willing to do trainings. There's also the Nebraska Indian Child Welfare Coalition, and they also do a number of trainings. Misty Flowers is their executive director, and she does trainings on historical trauma, on boarding schools, on being trauma-informed in Indian country. So I think she would be an excellent resource just for your overall program as well. Thank you for that question.
All right, any other questions here? On the back, okay.
I had a question about schools on reservations. And you talked about briefly before how due to COVID, a lot of your elders passed away, and they were the main people who spoke your languages fluently. I was wondering if in the schools you guys are putting together classes that maybe teach your native languages. And I'm a future educator myself. I was wondering if there's anything that I could do to maybe implement some, native language into my classes.
Yeah, so I went to school at Winnebago Public School, and there was a significant Indigenous paradigm. If you walk into the school, you know that it is a school that is for Indigenous students. There's a lot of language on the walls, there's a lot of cultural art, a lot of cultural practices that are just regularly implemented into the school, and also because of the teachers and the staff are not Native, they immerse themselves within the culture and they're able to share that language. So they're stepping up and they're saying, like speaking our language, like, oh, how's your Dega doing, which is uncle, or how's your Choka doing, which is your grandpa. They're stepping up and they're sharing that language with us, which helps validate our identity and bridge that connection to us. And also a way to further your education in our language. A lot of tribes have, language apps. I know that the Omaha, the Ponca, they do, and there's also different dictionaries out there. The Ponca language does have their own dictionary. So those are just a couple of resources of how to become more familiar with the language. Thank you.
I'll add really quickly too, sorry, I know I'm talking a lot. In Winnebago, they have a program called Ho Chunk Renaissance, and with that program, they go into the schools and they're teaching their children their language, so that's a big part of how they're stepping up. There's also the Nebraska Indian Community College that is available for anyone to enroll right now. They are offering their courses at $1 per credit hour, so not to be competing with the school that we're in right now. But if there's a specific course that you would like to take, they do offer Dakota language as well as Omaha language. And again, that's the Nebraska Indian Community College. You can take those courses to learn more about the language and culture. Thank you.
All right.
Hello, thank you for coming here. I was wondering, I wanted to hear some Indigenous voices on how marginalized communities will compare themselves to other communities. And I was wondering if you find it like presumptuous when people make comparisons, or if you find it helpful when people find comparisons. Because, for example, like in queer culture and Indigenous culture, both of us have that experience of like how that culture is like, and with Black culture, like that, the information about it is like very like lean. It's not in there at all. And like, the elder members in like the trans community, we don't have them very often because they get killed and silenced a lot. So those comparisons I thought were useful in like finding community between communities. I just didn't know whether or not people in the community might find that presumptuous or like rude.
Okay, thank you for that question, and I love that you're highlighting that. What I think the common thread there is that shared experience of being marginalized, that shared experience of resources that are unavailable, and that can move us away from some of what we may see as presumptuous, but there are still different groups, you know, and so it's important to recognize that because there are still different challenges. So it's still important to honor that. And some of the horrific things that have happened based on these who we are as people. And so again, I think there's a fine line, a really difficult balance to maintain in that, because again, it goes back to the shared experience, and there's power behind that. There's so much power behind that. There is so much that we can learn through our collective wisdom through these shared experiences. So I think it's good to be able to highlight when we're talking about marginalized populations, but I think it's also very important to recognize the idiosyncrasies of each of these as well, and honor and respect those too.
All right, so the next question goes for Kelly. You mentioned your experience at Southeast. What are things that teachers at school or teenagers can do to help prevent the experience from them happening to others?
For me personally, I feel like just if someone befriended me, or if somebody asked if I was okay, then I would have been all right. I think just if one person said something to me, then I would have been okay. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Can you hear me? Okay. I can hear me, so. On behalf of the college, the students, staff, faculty, and our community, we want to thank you, our panelists, for coming today, and also Mr. Joe Pilcher for sharing the beautiful music, the history and context behind that music today. We do look forward to hearing some more of that at the end, but it has been enlightening, convicting for me. I'll speak for myself. To hear from you all about the hard truths, about our shared history and some of the current implications of those things today. It's been educational to learn about the local and national Indigenous issues, and Cynthia particularly for sharing some of the culturally appropriate and honoring language that we can be incorporating into our communication with one another and in the community. Thank you for sharing the truths of your experience and bringing to our attention the gaps that exist in our schools and communities. And thank you, Anitra, especially for providing services, taking your own loss and your own healing journey and sharing that with other marginalized and traumatized populations across the state. I would ask you all to please join me in offering our panelists and Joe a warm, gracious Southeast Community College thank you for their presence today. I'd like to say just one more thing. Thank you again to our global education team. And also, as you do leave today, we would invite you, especially students, but please everyone, to fill out, to complete a survey. There's a QR code you can see at the end of the room, Nicole's holding up. If you could scan that and complete the survey before you leave today, that would be greatly appreciated. Thank you again to our attendees and our panelists and to Joe. It's been a wonderful, wonderful time together today. Thank you.